So listeners, just pause for a moment and assume that at the age of 31, you're in a plane crash, and the pilot is killed, and your friend is killed, and your back is broken, and you have to lie on your back in a hospital bed for 6 months, and then you have to learn to walk all over again. That would be the defining, and it leaves you in pain for the rest of your life, physical pain for the rest of your life. That would have to be the defining moment of any one of our lives. And like the word you used, Mark, it was almost parenthetical for Ted Kennedy.
That was our guest, John Farrell, talking about Ted Kennedy, member of the iconic Kennedy family and a fixture in the U.S. Senate for nearly a half a century. I'm Mark Updegrove.
And I'm Mark Lawrence, and this is With the Bark Off. John Farrell is a former White House correspondent and Washington editor for the Boston Globe, and a former Washington bureau chief and columnist for the Denver Post. He's also a best-selling and award-winning author whose works include Tip O'Neill and the Democratic Century, Clarence Darrow, Attorney for the Damned, and Richard Nixon, The Life, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize that he discussed in an earlier episode of this program.
His latest book, Ted Kennedy, A Life, explores Senator Kennedy's remarkable 77 years, rife with inconceivable triumph and unimaginable tragedy.
John Farrell, thank you so much for joining us on With the Bark Off. And congratulations on your new book, Ted Kennedy, A Life. Ted Kennedy has to be one of the most fascinating figures in American political life in the 20th century. He's been criticized, obviously, as a frivolous, as a reckless man of privilege. And he's also been celebrated as this lion of American politics. There are, in other words, wildly different opinions about Ted Kennedy. As a biographer, as you attacked this project, how did you deal with all of that noise, if I can put it that way, and find your own path to writing about Ted Kennedy?
Yeah. Well, first, let me thank you for having me on. I love coming to Austin, and I make sure that no matter what I'm doing, whatever the subject is of my books, it entails a trip for research to either the LBJ Library or the University of Texas. And so I'm 4 for 4 so far. The thing I try to do as a biographer is tune that out. I think I have grown over the years to focus on almost a holy mission of biography, which is to push the politics aside and try to solve the riddle of the person. And the thing that surprised me the most in doing Ted Kennedy's story is that even though I knew him, of all the 4 persons I've done, 2 of whom had died before I started, he was the one I knew personally the most, and I thought I had a good handle on him. And in fact, there was so much about him that had been hidden by the process of celebrity, by the process of polarization that you spoke of, that it was a true treasure hunt for me to dig and dig and dig and find the what I think is the real person at the end of all that digging. And it's not the person that people anticipate. They anticipate either the lion of the Senate or the spoiled little rich boy, and it was neither. It was a very flawed, in many ways sorrowful human being.
Let me quote you from the beginning of the book, John, in which you write, "By the time Ted Kennedy got to Harvard, he had attended 10 schools. The experience left him unsure. He stumbled over words, a cognitive tell. He did better when rehearsed, and he knew it. Throughout his life, he would compensate via intense preparation and relentless effort. It made for an intricate and complex character. That marvelous affability joined with drive and perseverance, insecurities addressed by toil, and anxiety solved by self-indulgence. He would spend that life seeking to catch up to his siblings. The disadvantage of my position is being constantly compared with brothers of such superior ability," he would say. How did this niche in the Kennedy family shaped Ted Kennedy?
Well, he was the ninth brother, first of all, and I've been accused of going a little hard on his mom, Rose, because she comes under some withering criticism in the book by her children and her grandchildren. Maria Shriver said famously when asked whether or not Eunice Shriver, her mom, had given her a lot of personal attention, that no, not really, but you can't give what you didn't get. And there was a hole in a lot of the Kennedy kids' lives because of the distance from their mom, who was traveling an awful lot, the distance from their dad, who was traveling and a notorious philanderer, and a very busy businessman, and to give Rose an excuse, she had 9 children, which can be extremely exhausting. So the kids, despite the Life magazine imagery that Joseph Kennedy was so good at contriving, they all had their hang-ups, and Ted, coming along as the last one, I think probably felt it the most. And he was kicked around. His files are filled with letters from his masters at school saying, "You can't move this kid again. It's really going to affect his intellectual development." But then he was moved out of Massachusetts down to Palm Beach because Rose wanted to be there for the winter season.
So you naturally point out the garrulous, the fun-loving side of Ted Kennedy that some of us are probably most familiar with, but you also suggest, I think very interestingly, that he was often lonely and maybe even something of an introvert. I wonder if you could talk about, what was really at the core of Ted Kennedy's personality as you see it.
Yeah, I think first, it was all about family. It was all about family. There was a tremendous feeling of duty and loyalty to family, and that only increased geometrically as his older brothers and sisters were taken from him through an incredible series of tragedies that we're familiar with. And he always felt insufficient, in part because these older brothers, especially Jack and Bob, but also Joe Jr., who was killed in World War II, were sort of frozen as young heroes. They were frozen under the age of 50. And Ted was the one who got to live to be fat and to be caught by a changing media that used to give his older brother Jack a pass on his lifestyle. And so in many ways, Ted was almost trapped by this feeling of duty to his family, to his brothers. One of the interesting things I found after Chappaquiddick was that he told his sister Jean a couple of days after the accident that he had tried to cover it up, but it was not because he worried about his own political career, because he wanted to be president, but he just couldn't stand the idea about what this was going to do to the image of the family. And he worked ceaselessly throughout his life trying to keep the family together for the younger Kennedys, for the next generation as well.
We'll get back to Chappaquiddick and the many tragedies that befell Ted Kennedy and the Kennedy family, John. But before we move on to those aspects of Kennedy's life, let me just talk about his inauspicious early life. I talked about the many schools that he attended before going to Harvard based on the book, but it bears mentioning that he got kicked out of Harvard for cheating. And yet, despite the fact that he hadn't achieved much, he becomes a U.S. Senator in 1962 at the age of 30. How do you explain his ascent through the political ranks and his not only becoming a senator, but becoming a successful senator in time?
Well, one thing is it's very hard to comprehend now that we have the second Irish Catholic president in office. But back in 1960, the Kennedys were still laboring against what was believed to be a very imposing barrier. Al Smith had run as the first Irish Catholic in the 1920s for president and had been soundly defeated across the South and the Midwest and the West, with discussions about how the Pope was going to be running the American government if he ever got elected, and the great unwashed immigrants, which in those days were coming from Ireland and Italy, would be taking over the government and jamming the welfare rolls. So there was a guy named Charles Daly who worked for all three brothers, and he called them well-fed underdogs with plenty of bite. And they got that underdog feeling from the fact that despite the fact that they were gorgeous and despite the fact that they were rich and their father was one of the most powerful men in America, within the family there was still this feeling of prejudice and bias against them. And at one time, Robert Kennedy made a reference to it in either an interview or a speech, and somebody wrote him a letter and said, "Come on! I mean, when your father fled Boston, he fled it in a private railway car, and went and moved to Bronxville in Westchester County.
Right.
It's not like you were worried about no Irish need apply signs." And Robert wrote back and said, that's true. We never felt it directly, but because of, our grandfather was in our life, the former mayor of Boston, John Fitzgerald, Honey Fitz, as he was called, that legacy, that feeling was there. And so in Massachusetts, which had a very long history of a battling between the what was called the Brahmins, the Anglo-Saxons who had started the colony, and the Irish who came 400 years later. This was a very real thing. And when JFK ran in 1960, he became the closest thing to a secular saint for the voters of Massachusetts. And so when Ted ran again in 1962 to take Jack's seat, it was basically Ted had to not screw up badly because the Kennedys were that popular. And either you, Mark, or I can tell the story about the comment from the laborer on the day after the Great Debate. Do you want me to do it?
No, please do. No, yes, by all means. This is your
We've
book.
shared this among ourselves. So it was. He ran against a fellow named Eddie McCormick, and Eddie McCormick was the nephew of the Speaker of the House, John McCormick. So it wasn't like he was some little guy. And in their first debate, which was held at Ed McCormick's alma mater, South Boston High School, Eddie went after Teddy really hard and said, you haven't worked a day in your life. You're here only because your last name is Kennedy. It's your father's money and your brother's aura. That's the only reason that you're here. And so the next day, Ted, still not completely sure that he had done as well as he might have in that debate, was out shaking hands. I think it was there are many different tales as to whether it was a bakery or a factory. But this guy said, "Hey, Kennedy, I hear you haven't worked a day in your life." And Teddy sort of braced, feeling here it's going to come. And the guy said, "Let me tell you, you haven't missed a thing."
Can I just let me ask about the Kennedy family for a moment? It's the Kennedys epitomize what it is to be family. How do you explain that esprit de corps, that blood is thicker than water, the us against the world feeling that the Kennedys seem to embrace, John?
Yeah, well, there was there was the Irish American thing.
Yep.
Second of all was that the dad, Joseph, was constantly driving this home. The only people that you can depend on are family. You have to be loyal to family. This was part of his creed, and I think that too. The 9 kids were left alone a lot, and so the brothers and sisters together developed this very close, intimate relationship because they were the ones that they went to for love and affection and scorn and ridicule and everything that parents, discipline, everything that parents give you, whether it was participating in campaigns together or where it was those amazingly famous touch football games. They were very, very, very tight knit, I think, because of that. It's kind of a weird thing, your parents aren't there, and so you and your siblings become much closer. I'm sure that anybody who grew up in a house where there was a difficult relationship with their parents sort of recognized this phenomena. You don't expect it to happen at a very wealthy household like the Kennedys, but it did.
Let's talk a little bit about Ted Kennedy's relationship with two of those siblings in particular. First of all, John F. Kennedy. Ted Kennedy was very young, I think 29, when his brother became president of the United States. Tell us a little bit about the relationship between these two brothers, almost 15 years apart in age.
Well, Teddy, as the baby, as the little fat guy, the last one, came in, he said later, for some really tough ribbing by the older brothers. And part of it was the sort of the Kennedy ethos that, whatever doesn't break you makes you tough. And so, let's throw footballs at little Teddy's feet and knock him down. Let's dump him out of the sailboat and see if he can swim. And so, there was some of that. But as they, and of course, he idolized them, because by the time JFK came home from war in 1945 and almost immediately ran for the House of Representatives and then became a United States Senator. And by 1956, he was clearly a presidential possibility, if not an announced candidate. And they were dashing, heroic guys. And, in addition to that, Ted, follows Jack around, gets involved in the campaigns, and gets involved in some of the extracurricular activity as well. And so he's got this movie star of a brother who's this dashing knight on a horse, and has is oozing charisma and having a great time with his money, and betting young women around the world. And it's what would stop you from idolizing an older brother like that? And Jack, over time, as that 15 years is really big when somebody's 20 and the other one's 5. But by the time somebody's 45 and the other one's 30, life brings you a little bit closer together. And so, he was always still Teddy, the younger brother, but they could do things. They could discuss political problems on an equal level by the time that JFK was in the presidency. And he gave him a lot of advice on how to run in 1962.
And actually, it's interesting. He was not for his brother running in 1962, and yet supported it because his father was in favor of him running for the Senate. Is that right, John?
That's true. Both JFK had come in, he'd been elected, and he had named his campaign manager and younger brother Robert as Attorney General, and everybody knew the influence that Joseph Kennedy had on the boys, and so all of a sudden you had three imposing Kennedy male figures, political figures involved in the American politics, one as the president, one as the attorney general. And the last thing that they wanted was to revive the sort of Kennedy dynasty charges that, just this, the young prince gets to bed all the village maiden and ride away back to the castle, because that's what young princes get, and we're gonna treat the Massachusetts Senate seat as something we bought and paid for, and it's a bauble that stays in the family. And so the last thing that JFK and RFK and a lot of John Kennedy's aides wanted was something that would raise that issue again. And of course, Joseph Kennedy saying, "I want my son to keep the seat. We paid for it." Had just that effect. We bought it; it's ours. Had just that effect, and so they were very worried about their dad's designs, and so were the political professionals like Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers and Larry O'Brien, who were in charge of making sure that JFK got reelected in 1964. There probably was more tension there.
JFK's assassination obviously hit Ted Kennedy very hard, but to my eye, at least, to my reading, you suggest in your book that Bobby Kennedy's assassination really wounded Ted Kennedy even more deeply. Tell us what was so special about the Bobby Kennedy-Ted Kennedy relationship, and why that assassination seemed to be such a profound moment in Ted Kennedy's life.
I think that it goes back to to JFK's assassination first, because that totally wrecked Robert. And Ted said in later years that they wondered whether they were going to lose him, whether to grief or maybe he would harm himself. I mean, he was that desperate and desolate after JFK was killed. And Teddy, being the more affable, lighter of the two brothers, was given the tasks of, like, sitting down with Chief Justice Warren and reviewing all the autopsy photographs and the reports of the Warren Commission, because Bobby was so torn that Teddy had to do it. So everybody worried about Bobby and nobody worried about Ted. And in Irish American families in those days, you didn't do an awful lot of worrying about things like grief and shock. Anyways, if you needed a psychologist, you went out and walked on the beach. You took a long walk on the beach, or maybe you talked to your wife. But probably not.
It's a lot cheaper too.
So then Robert goes through this transformation, and Robert Kennedy, who had been this steely little runt of a guy who ran his brother's campaign, now becomes a public character. And lo and behold, because he has now been exposed to such hurt himself, he finds that he is a great empath. He is identifies with the Vietnamese, with the Viet Cong. He identifies with the black kids in the ghettos and the farm workers and the Indians on the reservations and the black kids in the Mississippi Delta, and all of a sudden he's running for president. He's running against Lyndon Johnson, and Ted Kennedy does not want him to run because A, it's going to tear the party apart, but B, he's also afraid that there's something out there in American violent culture that's going to claim Robert's life as well, and it does. And so now Teddy has no Bobby to act as the umbrella, act as the shield. Everything's on his shoulders. And he was never, if there's a theme in the book, it's this: he was never supposed to be the guy who ran that family. He was always going to be the younger brother, even as the United States Senator. And all of a sudden now, at the age of I forget how old he was, but before the age of 40, he now has this legacy on his shoulders. Millions of Americans are looking to him within hours after Robert Kennedy is killed and saying, you have to get in the race. You have to be our president. And he had no political training for that, and of course he had no family training for being a leader within the family. And so much of the story of the rest of his life is of him scrambling, of him trying to meet expectations that he was never supposed to have to meet. I use the analogy of the family jester, and now all of a sudden the crown is on the jester's shoulders, and nobody ever expected that was going to happen.
So, John, we just talked about two of the tragedies that befall the Kennedy family, those that are the best known, the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy. But as you point out in the book, there are so many other tragedies in the Kennedy saga, some of which are, you call parenthetical, even though if they hit one of us, they would be defining moments in our lives. Can you just enumerate the tragedies that Ted Kennedy has to face during the course of his very eventful life?
So listeners, just pause for a moment and assume that at the age of 31, you're in a plane crash, and the pilot is killed, and your friend is killed, and your back is broken, and you have to lie on your back in a hospital bed for 6 months, and then you have to learn to walk all over again. That would be the defining, and it leaves you in pain for the rest of your life, physical pain for the rest of your life. That would have to be the defining moment of any one of our lives. And like the word you used, Mark, it was almost parenthetical for Ted Kennedy. He had any one of us who has a spouse with a problem of substance abuse, that would be a defining moment in your life. Joan Kennedy was an alcoholic. That couple had 3 children, all of whom came down with some form of cancer before the age of 43. All 3 of your children. I mean, he spent hours for each one of those kids in cancer wards or on his knees praying for their recovery. Again, things that don't sort of reach home to us. He lost a sister who was given a lobotomy, and it was a botched operation, and Rosemary had to be taken away. Another sister, Kathleen, dies in a plane crash in Europe. Joe Kennedy Jr. dies in war in World War II. So, all this is going on before you even get to these two gruesome assassinations. So, I mean, his life was just complete torment. And one of the things that I liked about Ted, as I came to the end of my research, was that he told the head of the oral history program at the University of Virginia, who did the Ted Kennedy oral histories, and one of the last things he said to him while he knew he was dying was, I guess I was always just running to stay ahead of the darkness. And that, I think, explains not just his social life and the foibles of his personal life, but I think it also explains his amazing record in Congress. He never, ever stopped working.
Now, another low point, to put it mildly, in Ted Kennedy's life comes with the Chappaquiddick episode in 1969. An episode, of course, that continues to inspire controversy and fascination. At the center of much of the discussion, it seems to me, has been the question of why Ted Kennedy behaved as he did after driving off a bridge in a horrible accident that led to the death of the young woman, Mary Jo Kopechne. How do you, in your book, explain Ted Kennedy's behavior in those all-important hours after this tragedy that would do so much to shape his political career for the rest of his life?
Yeah, I think that there were two great mysteries. That's one of them. The unknown mystery that will never get solved is where were he and Mary Jo going? Were they going to go for a walk on the beach to console each other over the fact that they both missed Robert Kennedy? Were they going off for a romantic assignment? I think it's pretty well determined that they were not going back to their hotels to get a good night's sleep separately because they had a big day ahead of them, which is what the public story was. But we'll never really know what that relationship was, although Ted gave, in his own memoir, gave some intriguing hints that they were sharing a moment, an emotional moment together. Whether that could have led to romance or not, or sex or not, I don't know. That's the unknowable mystery. But I think that I put a final piece of the puzzle together on the other mystery, which is the question that you raised, which is, why did he do the things that he did? Was there a cover-up, and if so, what kind of cover-up was it? And that came because Arthur Schlesinger, our good friend, the late historian, has a 9,000-page diary of which only 500 pages were published when his family published the book several years back. And in those pages, he recounts what Ted Kennedy told his brothers and sisters, and what they and Ted told Arthur in that week after Chappaquiddick. And Teddy says, yes, I panicked. My first instinct, I was so afraid about what this was going to do to my family. It was, here I was, the screw up again. I can't believe that this happened to me. Why did it happen to me? Maybe it doesn't have to happen to me. Maybe I can get back to Edgartown, which is across a small body of water from Chappaquiddick, appear in my hotel at 2:00 in the morning, tell my aides to not call the police. I'll take care of calling the police, and let her body be found, and let them assume that she was driving the car by herself, or that somebody else had been driving the car. And that was his impulse. That was his instinct. It was stupid. It was craven. Even his mother said later that it was despicable to leave that poor girl in that car overnight like that. But that was his cowardly first reaction to the accident. There wasn't really a gigantic cover-up in the idea, comparable, say, to the Nixon-Watergate cover-up, with people having constant meetings about how we're going to finagle the police. The local authorities were, so awed by the Kennedys in Massachusetts that they didn't need a cover-up. They treated everything with kid gloves. And then when the press started accusing them of that, they doubled back and went in the opposite direction and had tried to exhume the body, and then had this amazingly long hearing in Edgartown, both of which would never have happened to somebody else who was in a fatal accident. So they went back in the opposite direction. So the cover-up ended all in the first 12 hours. It was all Ted Kennedy's personal cover-up, and now we have it in his own words, coming out of his own mouth, almost as a confession, speaking to his brothers and talking to Arthur Schlesinger. I mean, speaking to his sisters and talking to Arthur Schlesinger.
And despite the taint of Chappaquiddick, Ted Kennedy remains a viable candidate for president in 1972, and in particular in 1976, John, and yet he opts not to run. Why?
Well, it's astonishing, isn't it? I mean, looking back now and saying after Chappaquiddick he remains a viable president.
Yeah, that in itself is astounding. You're absolutely right. You're right.
I know, and yet it's the shocking, stunning truth. In '76, I think he didn't run because his oldest. Well, first of all, he's having problems with his wife's alcoholism, but also because his oldest son, Ted Jr., came down with cancer at the age of 12 or 13 and had to have his leg amputated. And it was just too much a burden. I don't think that it was Chappaquiddick that scared him out of the race. It probably was in 72. But in 72 and 76, throughout that period, this is a guy who is really torn about his family, and the idea that he's going to go out and run for president and then serve in the White House in the Oval Office in the height of the Cold War is intimidating to him. And so, it wasn't just 72 and 76, Mark, it was 68.
Right.
At the 68 convention, there was a Let's Nominate Ted movement in Chicago, and smart people called him in Hyannis, said, you can get the nomination. I don't know what it would have been worth after what happened in Chicago 2 nights later, but with the rioting in the streets and the way the party was torn apart. But maybe he, might have been the guy that pulled it together. And then of course he runs in 1980, which was a disaster, an easily avoidable disaster on Jimmy Carter's part. But the arrogance of both sides is stunning, and they let the personal get into the political, and it's actually somewhat reassuring that our public officials are not robots, that they can develop the deep, passionate feelings of hatred for each other and let that affect what otherwise would be their decision. Robert Carroll, a guy you guys may have heard of, has an amazing story in his book about Robert Moses, in which there was one moment where everybody in New York knew that Robert Moses had to be elected mayor, but there was one crusty old reformer who hated Robert Moses, and Robert Moses had hated them and then gone at it behind closed doors, and he had just enough clout to say, nope, it ain't going to be Robert Moses, and instead it was Farrell of LaGuardia, and so New York gets a great mayor and an airport, and Robert Moses gets a state park and a highway.
So, John, you're saying it was personal animus that leads to him throwing his hat in the ring for the nomination in 1980. And despite the fact that it really compromised the party, and ultimately when Carter got the nomination as the incumbent president, his candidacy, his ability to get reelected. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that both of them can be blamed for Ronald Reagan's ascendancy that year. There was no reason why Jimmy Carter could not have given Ted Kennedy his health care bill, a strong endorsement of his health care bill, because it wasn't going anywhere anyway. This argument was made to him by Richard Moe, who was Walter Mondale, Vice President Mondale's chief of staff. Throw him a bone. Name Archibald Cox, longtime Kennedy Harvard professor. Name him to the Supreme Court. and it was just pettiness because the Carter people had convinced themselves over the years that the Eastern elite hated them. The Massachusetts politicians were not that kind. They looked down on us because we're from Georgia, and this enmity grew. But there were two other factors. One was that I think it's overlooked. One was that the governor of California had already announced that he was going to challenge Jimmy Carter. So it was going to be like 1968. The party was going to be torn apart no matter what. And Teddy remembered that Robert Kennedy, thinking that he would keep the party together, did not enter the race until after Eugene McCarthy entered the race and stunned Lyndon Johnson in New Hampshire and basically drove Lyndon Johnson out of the 1968 campaign. And so there was a lesson there that Ted Kennedy probably thought of, although I never heard it come out of his lips. But that, all right, it's going to be charged, and I don't want what happened to Bobby to happen to me and then have to get in late because Jerry Brown has shown that Jimmy Carter is vulnerable. But then the last thing, too, is that, and I think there's validity to this because Teddy was a person of feelings, and he describes this moment in his memoirs of listening to Jimmy Carter give the famous Malaise speech from after the retreat at Camp David in the summer of 1979, and just being furious because this is everything that his brother John F. Kennedy and his other brother R.F. Kennedy were against. A feeling of hand wringing and we can't do these things. Our moment is over. And that was just not John Kennedy. It was just the opposite. It was our moment is now, vigor. Let's move the new frontier. Let's go to the moon. And so I think that there was on top of the personal bad feelings, there was that. But you cannot forgive Ted Kennedy for what he did in the summer of 1980, which once Carter had beaten him, Ted should have folded his tent, been a good soldier, realized that Reagan was a greater threat to what Ted ostensibly believed in, and supported him all the way instead of half-heartedly.
After 1980, Ted Kennedy's name would, of course, pop up from time to time in connection with the presidency, as I remember well, having grown up in that period in Massachusetts. But it seems to me that from the 1980s on, Ted Kennedy increasingly settled into his role in the Senate, and these were the years in which he really became that lion of the Senate. Let's talk a little bit about the factors that made him such an effective member of the Senate. One asset was undoubtedly the name Kennedy and the mystique that it carried. Tell us a little bit about how he benefited over his long career from being, the little brother of RFK and JFK.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it attracted great staff. Everybody who graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law, that was one of their options. Let's go to work for Kennedy on Capitol Hill. And over time, the size of that staff grew and grew until it was almost this little battalion of its own of really bright, ambitious, liberal guys all trying to impress the boss and carry the standard a little bit further. Another thing that he had was the ability just to dazzle. He could call in somebody, and he did this over and over and over again, and meet them in the office, and then put his arm around them and say, because you went into that office, and they've recreated it in Massachusetts in Boston at the Edward Kennedy Institute, so you can see it now. But he would put his arm around people, and they'd go over and say, well, let's see this no Irish need apply sign. That was given by Honey Fitz to my mother, and yada, yada, yada. And here's this little letter that Bobby wrote when he was getting B's and C's, and Mom wanted him to get A's. And here's the coconut from when Jack was lost in the South Pacific over PT 109 and had to carve the instructions as to where he was to the searchers. And that was it wasn't really it was intimidating, but it also made you think that if you aligned yourself with this person, you were aligning yourself with American history. And so a Quayle Kennedy bill or a Kassebaum Kennedy bill would have your name on it for all time, and you would get a little bit of that greatness, that charisma, and then finally, just he was Teddy. His for the other spoiled rich boys in the Senate, who had their own foibles and weaknesses, he was just this great, affable, as his father said, as affable as an Irish cop. Great guy to be around. He'd have great arguments with Alan Simpson and John McCain, shouting obscenities at each other on the floor. And yet they would walk off the Senate floor and they would combine to work on landmark immigration bills. I mean, it was just, he was definitely a force of nature at a time.
Talking about why Ted Kennedy was such an effective senator, you really highlight in the book, it seems to me, that he was a really hard worker, something that may in fact not fit all that well with our sense of him as a playboy or someone who could enjoy his time off. Talk about his command of the issues and the sheer amount of energy and study that he put into the topics that interested him most.
Well, you have to start with family, and so there were what were known as the legacy issues that were very important to him. And they were civil rights because of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy's involvement in civil rights, American Indians, farm workers, unions, Medicare, anything that immigration, anything that John Kennedy or Robert Kennedy had taken on as a special issue became a legacy issue for Ted. Also because of the incredible amount of time that he spent in and out of hospitals, I think healthcare became a very important. He called it the cause of my life, to bring accessible healthcare to all Americans. But I think there was a personal element to that, in that when his son got cancer, he spent a lot of time in cancer wards, and he would talk to people, and they would say, "Oh, Senator, this is awful. I can afford 2/3 of what they want to charge me for chemotherapy for my kid for the next year. But what does that mean? Does that mean that we got to stop 2/3 of the way through the year?" I always like to say that American presidential campaigns are great because not only do the candidates speak to the people, but the people educate the candidates. And this was on rope lines and in town halls, and they talk and they ask questions. And this, I think, was part of Ted Kennedy's education on healthcare. I think that he was driven to work so hard because he realized that he had this opportunity to turn this legacy into something, and he had this duty, and also because I was a reporter for the Boston Globe covering him during the Palm Beach scandal era. And I once wrote a story comparing him to a shark. Sharks have to keep on swimming because if they don't, they drown. And I said, he's like a great white shark who has to keep swimming, otherwise he'll drown in his sorrows. And he sent me a little note, and at the end he signed it with he drew a little shark, and he signed it Ted the Shark. So this was in keeping with that, what he told his oral historian, which was that he was always moving to keep ahead of darkness. And I think that we were a great. That was a great contribution to American history and to all of our lives who lived during that era. On the flip side of that, though, was that there were times, as in Palm Beach, where he screwed up, and he woke his son and his nephew up at midnight on Good Friday, and said, "Let's go drinking and pick up girls." And the two boys brought home girls to the compound that night. Ted was sort of wandering around the compound, sloshed, and one of the girls claimed that she had been raped by Kennedy's nephew. And this happened, as it happened, right in the summer of the Clarence Thomas Anita Hill controversy. And because that was a question of sexual assault, and his nephew and his behavior on Good Friday was an issue of sexual assault, He did not have the moral standing to play the role that he had several years before when he helped stop the Robert Bork nomination to the Supreme Court. And when the hearings were held, the Thomas Hill hearings, he might have as well had a bag over his head because he just did not participate in any meaningful way, and he was ripped apart by everybody saw what was happening. He was ripped apart by Saturday Night Live and Jay Leno on the Tonight Show, and he became a laughing stock. And his hometown newspaper, the Boston Globe, editorialized and said, all throughout his career, we've always made the argument that his private foibles don't get in the way of his public performance. Now it's clear that they do. And there was a real issue as to whether or not he could get reelected in 1994. He ran against this young guy named Mitt Romney. And for a while it was very close. At Labor Day, Romney was actually ahead in that race. But that was an example where the private overlapped into the public. And fortunately for him and for the rest of us, he met Victoria Reggie Kennedy, now the ambassador to the American ambassador to Austria, but his wife and helpmate for the last 2 decades of his life, who really kept him on the straight and narrow, provided a lot of love, a lot of good advice. And do we have time? There's one great story that he tells of there was some sort of victory was achieved, and he stood in a room of family and friends, and he said, "I want to thank you because, without you, I wouldn't have won." And she stood up and said, with an epithet, an obscene epithet, "No, that's not true. You won. And if you lost, all the stories would have been about you losing. But you won this one. Give yourself credit." And in his memoir, it's a very sad passage, he says, that was something I needed to hear. And that clashes so much with our image of Ted Kennedy, happy-go-lucky, rich, charismatic, handsome playboy, that it's somewhat shocking. And we started the talk by talking about how I discovered a Kennedy that I didn't know, and that's a major part of that discovery.
So despite the scandal in Palm Beach, he once again recovers. By the millennium, he's celebrated as a lion in the Senate, and his support of Barack Obama makes a profound difference in Barack Obama's candidacy. And that's, I think, another major part of Ted Kennedy's legacy, at least chronologically, John. But why does Ted Kennedy support Barack Obama over the presumptive nominee, Hillary Clinton, in 2008?
I don't think he had any great personal feelings against the Clintons like he did against Jimmy Carter. But I think he felt that the Clintons had their chance. Bill Clinton had 2 terms. They had pushed health care. Bill had given it to Hillary. Together, the Clintons had bungled health care. And he saw in this new generational support for Obama an opportunity that he compared to what John F. Kennedy faced in 1960. We just finished 8 years of the W. Bush administration. Now that a new Democrat was coming in part because of very strong support from young Americans, and Ted believed, it's time to turn the page. It's time to move on. And his price for that endorsement was Obama's promise to work for universal health care, which the Clintons had tried to do and had failed at. But now Kennedy was saying to Obama, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do this with the understanding that you are going to fight for universal health care. And throughout that year, it's the year that Obama is running and winning the presidency, 2 things are happening. One is that Ted Kennedy's staff and Kennedy, to the extent that he can, is meeting with the insurance companies, meeting with the hospitals. He's setting up a bill patterned on what Mitt Romney had instituted in Massachusetts, which is known as Romney Care, setting up a bill that would then be called Obamacare. And then in private, he's suffering from brain cancer. So he is become this very sympathetic character within the party. He has a lot of sympathy chits to play, and he knows this because he's a great politician, and he plays every one of them superbly. If he's in the White House with Obama, and they're about to go out into the East Room and give talks about health care, and he grabs the president. He says, "Mr. President, don't let the moment pass. Remember, you're Julius Caesar. You know, there are tides in the affairs of men, and you'll rue it forever if you let this moment pass. Don't let it pass." By his example of coming to the Democratic Convention in Denver that summer and giving a speech, though he was in the midst of this battle with horrible brain cancer, he's building up support for this bill, so that so he doesn't get it. He's the role of Moses. He's on one side of the River Jordan, and he can see the other shore, but he can't cross over himself. He passes away, but even after he passes away, he has written this letter to be delivered posthumously to Obama, talking about why healthcare was the cause of his life, and saying to Obama, I know you promised me you would do this, and I know you will. And Obama, he goes all in. He doubles down. He reads that letter aloud to the nation, and they work hard. And I'm not naive enough, and I don't think you guys are either, to think that Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi fought for Obamacare because they wanted to give Ted Kennedy a lasting memorial because good old Ted is sick. But I think that, again, politicians are human beings. There are feelings of honor among them. There's sympathy among them. There's emotion for each other. And I think this applies to Obama. And I think he said as much in his own memoir when he talks about the night at the White House when the Affordable Care Act has passed, and there's a party, and he has signed it, and everybody's happy, and everybody goes home. And in his memoir, he says he goes up to the private quarters in the White House, and he's sitting there playing with his dog, and he says, it was a momentous night. I thought of two things. I thought of my mother, who had died of breast cancer, and I thought of Ted Kennedy. So as much as we think of these people as inhuman, they are actually human beings, and whatever extent the story of Ted Kennedy's demise had, I think it is definitely part of that passage of the Affordable Care Act. And I think that for that big slice of working America that relies on it, because they don't get private health care at work, or because they're making too much money to get Medicaid, it's a lasting legacy. And the last time I checked for the book, I think that the percentage of people who don't have health care in America right now is in the lower single digits, and it's mainly immigrants who are just afraid to sign up.
John, your book is so full of detail and paints Ted Kennedy in such a complicated way that it seems a little unfair to ask you to sum it all up. But nevertheless, let me ask you, what is Ted Kennedy's legacy?
Well, it's a legacy that I think we profit from now, but we can't be confident that it's a legacy that will last forever. I think that the two great issues that he championed were health care and civil rights. I think that civil rights is constantly the fruits of the civil rights movements are constantly under assault. The Voting Rights Act, I think, is a perfect example of that. But I think in healthcare, you have to look at Obamacare and wonder, now that we know that opposition forces will lie in wait for 20 or 30 years and then come out of nowhere and attack something like the Voting Rights Act that everybody thought was well established and standard operating procedure, we have to realize that there are powerful forces in the country that still view the Affordable Care Act and health care for all as Obamacare, a socialistic, democratic abomination. And so that legacy, I think, is in our hands rather than in his. There have to be more young Ted Kennedys come along to sustain that legacy. I think that's the lesson.
Our guest has been John Farrell, and his very comprehensive biography on Ted Kennedy is called just that, Ted Kennedy. John, thanks so much for being with us today.
Love you guys. Take care.
Thanks so much, John. My thanks to our sponsors, the Moody Foundation and St. David's Healthcare, and as always, to you for joining us. If you've enjoyed this episode, subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'm Mark Lawrence. See you next time.